Hi, this is Justin, and welcome again to the Psychic Roots of Poetry. I'm going to have a relatively short your program today because I really wanted just to review a couple of things and to give you some tips. You know, I've been talking a lot about soul speak as a contemporary version of ancient antiphonal poetry. That is the poetry we did in the hunter-gatherer stage when it was double voiced, and that poetry continued, by the way, all the way up until illiterate times. You can see it in the Greek theater, which of course is a product of being able to read and write. You can create your scripts, you know, so you can actually have a script that people can memorize and can talk out. But the early Greek plays, which were religious plays, they hadn't separated them yet, consisted of a hero who would tell you what he was doing, say that it's Oedipus, you know, and then there was a chorus that would move in the background. And from some of the notes that Dudley Fitz puts forth, who's studied the meters that are associated with those chorus statements, they were pretty spiffy. They weren't just slow-moving your Swarthmore girls or Vassar girls in white robes. That in fact we know the Greeks like colors, so that we can assume that your costumes were colorful, but the beats themselves were very complex, which means that the chorus was really moving it. It was still tribal. It wasn't the smooth stuff you see on TV, on PBS. They're very complex metrical beats, so they must have been stepping it. Hate to say it, but it was probably something like some of the hip-hop steps you see, you know. It just comes naturally. But that form is a form that lasted for tens of thousands of years, from the time that we first started to you praise the gods or speak to the gods, or from the time we were human. They're all the same thing. Really right up until you can see it in the Catholic Church. You can see it in a lot of hymns or antiphonal in nature. You can see it in the African American music. It's always antiphonal. You know, there's Gladys Knight and the Pips, okay? And it goes on endlessly and endlessly like that, because it all refers back to that most early and most powerful stage of poetry, where there was a performance, not as we know performance today. Somebody tells us what to do, but the person would paint their face to be their animal totem, their spirit totem, and that would consider also the painting of the body. This happened in all cultures, you know. We just see it today in Africa because that's where we can see it, but if we go into some tribes in the Amazon, we can see it too, or we can go into Guinea, we can see it, you know, so it goes on and on. The deal was to get on the borderline between the conscious and unconscious mind, where all poetry forms, and to let it rip for hours at a time. Movement, speaking, antiphonal speaking, speak to the gods. The tribe responded, added more to what the leader was saying, and so on and so forth. No script. There was a perhaps a kind of loose custom, but it changed all of the time. You know, it changed all the time, because like any story that's told, whether it's to the gods or to our friends, they always change slightly, even though we think it's the same joke. It's always, if you're alive, you're tweaking it. If you're not alive, you're one of those people who don't tweak it, and God help you if you have to listen to one of those people tell you a story that's supposed to be humorous. Anyway, I want you to know some more about that. And here's the place you can do it. This is where you can go, where there's a text you can download as a PDF. There's some nice things said about it by Bernie Siegel, you know, about soul speak. But if you want to know more about it, and if you want to know its history and how it fits into poetry, how it fits in is it's just a contemporary reproduction or version of what was done as the first version of poetry. That's the long and short of it. And it wasn't created by anybody. It's in us. I've taught it to I don't know how many thousands of people. And you don't teach it through a book. You just do it, and they do it back to you. Two people at the same time. It's amazing. It's just in our genes, you know. So anyway, that's something you should read. Also want to show you our webpage. I talk about it at times. This is what it looks like when you come up to it. It's soulspeak.org, SOULSPAK, just like it shows there, .org. And there's a link to me, and there's a link to Adora, who is a performer and psychic, who'll come on at 4:45 today. If you go to her webpage, it's the Adora webpage, which I'll start to post from time to time, and we'll start to get some emails out to you. But we're going to do the first one today. And you can take a look at all of our books here and all of our DVDs and CDs. You can download most of the books for free. You have to print them out, so it's about a break even between buying a book and between printing them out. But you can read it online if you want. We want you to read it. We're not in the business to make money. We'd like to make it. But as you know, the arts and money are unwilling partners for the most part. And once in a while, they just come together in extraordinary ways, as in the case of Elvis. You know, God love him, but he could have shared. But he kind of shared it a lot. He was good that way. You know, he bought everybody Cadillacs who was in the neighborhood. I happened to mention something last session, maybe the session beforehand, about a translation I had done from the Pidgin. I hope you can read this, and if you can't, I'll just kind of go through it. It's from a series of translations I did of Edward Vinoy. Let me just get my face back and talk to you about it a bit. The question always arises: where does the rhythm come from that we hear when the muse speaks, and also when the gods speak? The gods speak rhythmically, and they speak in metaphor. That is to say, the gods speak in poetry. They used to speak like that. Now they sound like Southern salesmen, basically. That's what the gods sound like today. It's Jimmy Swaggart and all that stuff. But when the gods spoke, that was when those psychic voices entered the minds of pre-literate peoples. We know from the historical record that they spoke in poetry, which means that they spoke in rhythm. Okay. And they also spoke, we know, in metaphor, because God helped the person who tried to interpret them literally. Sometimes it was very close to literal, but it's a very tricky game, prophecy, because it is a form of poetry, and I'm living in China might mean a lot of things, you know, because it always speaks in metaphor, and it could be that you're just living in an unconscious state, or it could be that you're in China somewhere, you know, you took a plane there, and of course anything in between. But I spoke about that rhythm, and I believe that the rhythm came when men first started to tell stories. I've been creating Einsteinian situations, which Einstein did in physics. I figured if he could do it in physics, which is a very rigorous business, not like poetry, you know, it just slides all over the place, as Paul Simon says, you know, that I could do it also in poetry. And so, in fact, the question comes, where does the rhythm in the God speaking come from? And somebody always say, well, the animals have rhythm, but the animals don't have rhythm. The animals have repeated sounds. And as any musician will tell you, the repeated sounds are not the same as rhythm. Rhythm is something overlaid on top of speech or gesture or song that is unique. And that is like a story in itself, you know, that's what's so great about African American music, is that the beat can be so variable and so complex that it's a story in itself on top of the word story and on top of the melody story, you know. So you can have anxious beats, you can have thunderous beats, you can have playful beats, you know. You got to get with it. But anyway, it's something that is unique to humans. And I believe it came, I said, that in fact I pondered this at some time, when the first humans started to tell stories, and they didn't have to tell them with words at this stage. They had their own animal sounds, which they would have been born with, and they had their gestures. And they have gestures, you can watch any animals. A chimpanzee has a series of gestures, has a series of vocal sounds. The trick when you tell a story is to combine those into a time continuum. And how a story works is that the story is a product of wanting to express a feeling that is more complex than simply anger or happy, you know. It wants to say something more, and what it does is it strings together incidents or images, if you want to think of that, using words or using gestures and sounds. Mime, you can do something entirely in mime, you know, like Marcel Marceau had some wonderful mimes he did. They weren't those silly mimes like this, but I mean, they're okay, but were mimes that were very moving. They were poems. They were poems without words. Somewhere along the line, there had to be something invented. Something had to come to man, most probably from his unconscious as well. That was a connector that said and then and but, because you have to string together events to get a story. I went down to the river. Nah, I saw you. Nah, I loved you. It's the first thing, and God knows what the love gesture was or what the word, but you can string them together without words. That was the first. I would say that's the very basis of languages. You have to have the connector, which allows you to string things together in time. And I found when I was doing some translations from the Aborigine Albert Vinoy, and here's one here, and if you have a big screen, you can read it. And I'm going to read it too. And I've put down the connector, which is always the same for and, now, yet, and but. It's going na. And in fact, I'm not going to read the pidgin because my eyes aren't good enough to read it from here. But it says, and when I sit down beside you to go to your home, the land outside of us is like a dark river, and the horses shining with moons on their backs. But I don't hear a sound, only the sound of our being. Yet I understand your song. Now I sing with you. That's called a very literal translation, blow for blow, with the pidgin, which is in small print. You may want to go back and blow the screen up and read it. It's quite interesting to see how much you can say with so few words. But the word and is na, the word but is na, the word yet is na, and the word now is na. And it would be the gesture of the speaker, na, and, okay, something like that, and nah, but, okay, what, nah, okay, that's how it's done in pidgin, by the way. There's so few words you have to use the gestures. There's one word where it's many things. Even in the most complex pidgins, there's about 400 words total, and most of them are very seldom used. It's a very complex of about 40 words that you use over and over again, and it's proof that by the time we reach hunter-gatherer stage that all of the grammars were intact. How that happened is something I'm going to talk about at some stage if I ever get to it. But basically, I think what happened is we invented rhythm. We did it in order to speak. And how we did that, I think, was just intuition. There was nobody to tell us how to do it. Just something came to us. Nah, and, yeah, nah, yet, so, yeah, nah, yeah, now, whatever those particular facial expressions would be the connector and. And if you read this in pidgin, which you can read for yourself when you bring it, that's just a small part of a poem by Vinoy, is you'll see that in fact it establishes a rhythm. No, that is unique to the passion and the emotion and the story itself, So what I think happened is that in the first stories that were told, somehow or other, the first humans stumbled upon some gesture and some sound to give the connector. And that sound of that sound, that feeling associated with that was absorbed by the unconscious, the animal unconscious. And so when the time came for the unconscious to speak, whenever it was going to speak to us, don't forget that we had a very thin consciousness at that stage, and we had our old animal consciousness, that there was something it felt. It's a feeling consciousness. I think you have to think about it that way. And the little feeling that came out was searching for na. For now, it was searching for the rhythm that was established by na. So the thing we see is we see a rhythmic speech, and because the unconscious has to search for words, for a best match, for something that its feeling will match whatever gestures or animal sounds we have in our conscious memories, out will come a vision, but basically, or maybe we'll just say in terms of your voice at some stage. I think what happens is that in the very first instances that early humans would have a vision, much as when they spoke to one another, it would be a face, some face. What face would that be? Well, my best guess is, besides, we're going to talk about the mother goddess who in fact eventually developed out of the first mother, but we can easily see that the first faces that would emerge out of the unconscious, the first the first images would be animal faces. And so that it was highly likely. It's hard for us to really imagine the importance of animals to pre-literate peoples, but if you do some of the reading on the subject, they always have, they were very close to animals. They weren't superior to animals when it came down to a life and death battle. That only developed later as they developed weapons of all kinds, you know. All they had was the ability to communicate a little bit better than the animals did, and that was a huge edge. And that communication eventually led to weapons and things like that, but they respected animals because animals were working on a hunting intelligence, instinctual intelligence, and they honored the animals, and they didn't treat them as schleps. You know, that's what we treat animals as schleps. Oh, you know, there's an old story about the Jewish mother who was happy when her kids go off to school and the dog dies. I hate to go walk the dog. You know, it's not a part of our psychic lives by and large. For people who live with animals, I mean they have loved pets and they live with them, really live with them and love them, that's a whole different story. But for our civilization, animals are second. You know, we come first. Plant life is forget the plant life. You know, so we have to remember that when the unconscious had something to say, and it was probably an instinctual part of the animal part of consciousness that became our unconscious, that would come forth as a animal face, probably the one that was close to the psychic totem of the person who was speaking. You know, the early man had instinctual liking for certain animals. Some man would be a snake, the other would be a tiger or the wolf. They would instinctually like. You know, one would like the way they move so stealthily, or panther, and that would probably be the animal face that would have appeared to them, and it would come forth with the animal sounds and the facial gestures. This is before we learned language. I believe that's what happened. And those were the first voices of the gods that spoke. They were visions that spoke, because you need the face, you need the gestures as well as the sounds to really communicate when you don't have words. Eventually, that the words, as an ordinary conversation, allowed us to communicate very complex things with only words, with only language, okay? But at some stage also, as we developed, and as stories about the first mother were told, who was the giver and taker of life, the lover, the procreator, the romancer, you know, the judge, everything. That as those stories developed, as in fact the generation started to develop, at some stage that the first mother appeared as psychically, broke through the consciousness of early peoples and became a god. When that happens, that image has a enormous authority. That's what happened to Abraham, and what happened to Muhammad, and what happened to Buddha. It's a breakthrough from the unconscious that is overpowering. And what those people saw, what those particular prophets saw, or what those particular, whatever you want to think of them as, is they went through a transfiguration. It's pretty clear. Moses as well. And what they went into, they experienced is the life force. You can call it God, but it's the unknowable. They experienced the unknowable as just a state of being. It just flooded them. And that flood brought them to a new level of consciousness. And when they came back, they went into a period of solitude and then went out with the lessons that had come to them. Sometimes you'd bring them down in stone, like Moses. That was a contract with the unknowable, okay? And with somebody like Buddha, that these principles eventually formed as to how other people could reach nirvana. And what makes it mysterious is that when they went out and spoke to people, people listened and followed them. You can go down to 42nd Street in New York and there'll be a Jesus on every corner yelling at you, but nobody's listening to them and nobody's following them. There's something in terms of the unknowable, which I try to describe as a kind of dreaming. I think that in fact the Aborigines had it right, that there's a dreaming is taking place. We don't know the source of the dreaming. But there are the various gods that are inside the dreaming, as are we. We can enter the dreaming. We are part of the dreaming, but we can actually speak to the the gods, the snake god, the serpent god, the kangaroo god, the water god, whatever it is. Those I explained to you are faces of God, pieces of the unknowable that have chosen to become conscious. And those are the gods that Abraham spoke to and Jesus spoke to and Muhammad spoke to. They're very powerful faces of the unknowable, but they're not the unknowable. Just to give you an example, this is a very simple example, so don't think about it too much, but let's take the example of Pip in Great Expectations, Dickens' great novel. Pip and Jaggers. Jaggers, the lawyer, is out to fuck everybody, you know. And poor Pip, he's just trying to be good, you know. They're going through this enormous drama. Pip is trying to find his way, and Jaggers is trying to crush everything in front of him. And they have a full sense of the world they're in, but they have no idea about Dickens. None. They might have a sense of that they're propelled by fate if Dickens chooses to give them that little insight that they're driven by some unknowable fate or something like that. But in the world that they're in the dream that they're in the dreaming that they're in, which is Dickens' dreaming, if you want to think about it that way, because the artistic impulse, the way he worked, Dickens' work, which is in the very early stages as a very unconscious artist, it's beautiful. It just kind of spills out, and the critics hate the form. It comes out serpentine, you know, it comes out just like a long story somebody would tell you orally. But he was just letting it go. And in that dreaming, there existed people who went to their lives and their deaths and their destiny, but had no idea about Dickens. Couldn't even imagine Dickens. Couldn't imagine him. We're in somewhat the same state with the unknowable. We can't even imagine it. We just know that there's a dreaming taking place. You can take it the way that Shakespeare described it. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, which I interpret as being that we are the screen upon which the unknowable plays itself out. We get to see the movie and we get to be in it, and that's the rub. But we have no idea what the unknowable is. Just some part of it has chosen to become visible on us, as though we were a screen. And we're in the movie too. We get to see it and we get to be in it. We have no idea what's happening. All we know is what's in the movie and what we're playing in it, and we don't know why we're there, and then we disappear and some other thing comes in, some other character comes in, you know. So I think at some time what happens in that larger dreaming, which is always orderly, and there's always some science of some kind. You go back to the astrology and numerology and the early physics of the Greeks and of course the later physics of the Western physicists. Order is always discovered, and then it falls apart because we know more, and then those rules don't hold up, and we get new rules, and we get new rules. And we're at the stage now where we look so far into matter, and all we see is energy. It's like little strings. I would say they're like snakes. Exactly the same image. If you ask a Ayuska shaman in the Amazon forest to tell you what is at the heart of creation, he'll say serpents intertwining, two intertwining serpents. It's not very far from what the scientists are seeing now, or they have to postulate exist in order for everything else to exist, you know. We'll get to the bottom of that, and then there'll be something else, and there'll be something else, and there'll be something else. All we know is there's an order that is disclosed, and we're hanging on to that order. But what is the nature of the mystery that we exist in, the dream we exist in? We have no idea. None. So what I think happens on occasion, for reasons beyond understanding, is that the unknowable, the truly unknowable, not the unknown, but the unknowable, chooses to come into time and space. And it comes into time and space to someone. And I think in the very early days of man, it came to almost every man, because we're talking about not highly psychic people like Moses and Mohammed and Jesus and Joseph Smith, but everybody was psychic. There was such a thin membrane between a very fragile conscious storytelling mind and the unconscious that it was constantly breaking through. And what happened at some stage is that there's an awareness, even in very early man, you can see it in some of the mythologies, there's something beyond the gods. And in the Witnesses Log myth that I brought up that had come to me, there is a group of entities called the listeners. And you also might want to know that in Some mythologies which come much later, they're called the Watchers. There's one that surrounds in the early books surrounding the Hebrew Bible. The Nebulum, I think, what they're called the Watchers. They're watching. Watching is associated with reading and writing. Listening is associated with pre-literate peoples, because pre-literate peoples lived in jungles, and you didn't survive long if you didn't listen correctly, because all the hunting took place at night. You know, at night your eyes are no good. So one of the ways that it depicts this dreaming source, the unknowable, is as the listeners. All it knows is there's an interest on the part of the listeners, but the listeners never come forth to speak directly. Only what they call the visitors in the myth appear. Those are your gods and your angels and everything else, and your animal gods, whatever it happens to be. All that the myth says about the listeners, besides they hear everything we feel, okay, meaning that they're hooked on a feeling level, is that when the listeners speak, it sounds like blood or water. And the visitors in the myth, who are the gods, say, nobody knows how to speak like blood or water, not even us. So what we have is, I think, is what happens in early man. There is a need to contact this source of interest. There's something beyond knowing. And what appears from the unconscious is a face of God. And eventually what came forth, in addition to their animal gods, was the mother goddess. It wasn't just a memory of the mother goddess, just a conscious memory that people have told you. It came through with all of the psychic force of a vision. To many of them, it seized them. Because after all, she was a very close fit to what happens in nature. The whole menstrual period was close to the moon. The 12 seasons, the birth, the death of plants, the bleeding of the great mother, went on and on and on. And of course those stories about her being the judge and looking out for the humans, making sure, protecting them, killing them if they got out of order. You know, humans are much more dangerous than chimpanzees. We've seen how really dangerous they can be to one another. But humans, once you start to think, you got your ace killer right there, you know. So that the mother was judge, procreator, lover, the begetter of the seasons, of the crops, was in rhythm to them. When that broke through in psychic force, it seized pre-literate man, I think, for thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years, until the mind evolved and it needed something more to go forward. And it then started to drop the mother goddess. They were pushed to the background, and the male gods came forth. Again, in the same way, from somewhere in the dreaming there was a need to make a face of God come forth, and you started to get your male gods. So why is that important? It's important because one of the faces of the mother goddess, if you want to think of it like that has endured. We have no psychic image of the mother goddess anymore. It's been bred out of us. We don't have any of Zeus anymore. Some of us might have it of the Western God, the God of Jesus, you know, the God of Abraham, probably more so of Mary or Jesus. But there are some people have report visions of God. It's not the unknowable. It's just the God of Jesus. Put it that way, the Father, you know. Although that would be a very, very rare instance. All of the mystics either have those visions through the vision of Jesus or through the vision of Mary. As the Jews said to Moses, we can't stand the voice of God. It's going to overpower and kill us. You have to go speak to God yourself and bring back what God says. It's based on the Bible. Nobody speaks like blood or water, you know. So what happened at some stage, I believe, is that as our languages developed, didn't have to be much, just beyond the kind of sound stage, you know, and just beyond the kind of gesture stage, is that the unconscious picked up, had already picked up the rhythm of human speech, okay? pick that up. That was a taste of time it just loved, just loved that taste of time from its brother. And at that time, we have to believe also that the early humans began to praise the gods, the mother goddess, the animal gods, whatever, that had appeared in order to reduce their loneliness. And what happened eventually out of that is the gods started to speak in a more human voice. They weren't the guiding voices that Jane speaks about. They were slightly different. They're a sharing voice. They're an artistic voice. They're a dreaming voice. And that dreaming voice has continued down through all the changes of the gods. It's gone right through the so-called primitive mother goddess times, which gave birth to it, through all of the Greek gods and all the Jewish gods and all the Christian gods and every other god. And it's still present. Artists still feel it. Those who have a little remnant of that older consciousness in them, as Jane says, and they hear those voices, or that presence, that energy, that former of worlds, that former of worlds. It forms worlds, and that they are given to you, and they can be given to you in many ways. It's not just words. The muse can come in images as well. Any good painter who paints from the unconscious, Michelangelo, who always started at the navel and worked out, had no idea what he was doing until it was finished. The muse was guiding him all the way. You could feel it rising up his spine. That's what you feel when it comes to you. So I wanted you to see how I see. That's one story. It's not the best story, and maybe it could be a little slicker, but it's basically what happens is that the dreaming, for unknowable reasons, puts a face of God forth through the unconscious to our conscious minds, and that in fact allows us, that guides us, and that in fact allows us to create little worlds. The worlds called art or poetry, which we share back with the unconscious. It loves those stories. Oh, it loves them. When you think of Shakespeare, we can think of him as having a passage to his artistic unconscious. The muse knew no impediment in Shakespeare. When you think of the worlds he produced with such ease and such rapidity, and as David Steiner said, he's an artist with no ideas. The only artist he could ever find had no ideas, which is exactly perfect in my mind, to have no ideas. So that the muse is always with us. And I'm going to close now just by giving you a very short video, if I could. Let me see here. Here's one that's not antiphonal, but it's something about the artistic process and how it comes to you. And of course, all of our voices now generally tend to be, unless you're doing soul speak or something like that in its original antiphonal form, you can do it in a single voice form too, is it comes in a single voice. So here's one. It's called Stairs. And we'll see you next week.
I'll tell you what, they've got one thing.
These are the stairs to nowhere. No one knows how you get here. You're just walking around, and all of a sudden, there you are, going up and up inside your head, and then down, and down again, and down. You love being here. Look at it. Everything is so beautiful. It never stops. You just keep going until the doors appear. No one knows where the doors go or how to open them. They just do, and then you're there. It's a large hall that goes on, and then it turns into light. You can't quite
keep your eyes on the light. It's different from you, but somehow you think that it's you as well. You can feel there are two of you, and one of you is light, and then you're going away somewhere. Somehow you walked out of the hall and down the stairs. I never knew it. It's hard getting back up to where the doors are. You have to wait a bit. Just take your time going up and down and around inside your mind. Why not? What else do you have to do that's important? Nothing. Just up and down the stairs, waiting for the light and the hall and the door and the room that will take you everywhere and nowhere, which is where you want to go. Finally. Finally.